come directly from Cleanthes, the founding Stoic poet. And by the time of the writing of Ephesians and 2 Timothy, Hellenistic worldviews were not only influencing but directing church life. And the book of Hebrews is suffused with Platonic imagery. So this notion of the Hellenic understanding of transcending spirit and imprisoning flesh was already there before the New Testament canon was formed. And that's what makes the writings of John so extraordinary. The author of that gospel knew very well the foundation of Hellenic thought. Spirit, the essence of heaven for Greeks, is in a constant battle to escape the imprisoning carcass of earthly matter. Sarx is the Greek word. You must be born of the Spirit, Jesus teaches Nicodemus. And we who are witnesses of God are born not of blood, nor of fleshly desire, nor of human will, but of God. It's hard to think of a more Hellenic phrase in the whole New Testament. But then, in the very next verse, John turns his Greek readers on their head. The Greek reads this way, and because you can put the words in the right order, the words go kai logos sarx egeneto. Logos, the word, the rational effulgence flowing from divinity into male minds, is generated into fleshly matter. A Greek philosopher reading that would have ground their teeth in outrage. I think this may be the second most revolutionary verse in the whole New Testament. Echo. Not least because, and by the way, if in the question time you want to ask me the most revolutionary verse, I'll tell you, but not unless you ask. Because John repudiates Marcionism and validates the heart of the Old Testament view of God and creation. So it drives me crazy when it's mistranslated. John does not say Word becomes human, nor that he redeems man or even humankind. There are well-known words the author could have used, but John chose different words. The Logos, the speaking breath word, dabar is the Hebrew, the Word of God, enters the fleshly cosmos. That's the Greek word he uses, cosmos, to redeem it, claim it back as the fleshly presence of God the Creator. You see why I say it's so revolutionary? John uses Greek language and Greek ideas to undermine the whole premise of Hellenic culture. The goal of God and those who follow God is not to escape earthly matter, but to reclaim it as God-breathed and holy. So that's why I've chosen those two alternative voices from the New Testament. Jesus is the antithesis of Heracles. The Nazarene hero empties himself of divinity to enter into the most vulnerable fleshliness of earth. Because, says John, Word did not become flesh to redeem the cosmos, but to rescue it. The Word did not, or the Beloved was not sent to be its condemnation, but its rescue. God loved the cosmos. The cosmos. And so it's no coincidence that in John's Gospel, women are first to bear witness to the truth of Jesus. I hope you've noticed this, or you will read it again to notice it. Jesus' own mother in chapter 2, the rejected Samaritan in chapter 4, first Martha, then her sister Mary in chapter 11, and culminating in Mary Magdalene's witness of Jesus as the divine gardener of paradise, redeemed in chapter 20. And let me remind you that as Jesus directed there in the garden, Mary told the disciples she had seen the Lord. And the whole Gospel of John is the unfolding of that claim. We have seen his glory. That means Mary Magdalene. She saw it, so that those who have not seen but believed will be blessed. The next dot point is a really important one, but I don't have time to spend a lot of unpacking of it, even though that was central to my thesis because of the Japanese philosopher I studied. Contradiction versus paradox, or I would call it the Western delusion. How can Jesus be, as our creeds claim, fully divine, yet fully human? Because the whole Western world is built on the foundation of what my philosophical hero Nishida calls the law of non-contradiction. A is not B. It is one or the other. It can never be both. Flesh, says Hellenism, can never inherit spirit. Heaven and earth are the two poles of eternal contradiction. But John's Gospel, which scholars believe was written long after Greek thinking had taken Christianity captive, defies that foundational rule. John celebrates paradox, the identity-breaking enemy of all rational theology. Spirit and flesh together divine. Rational teaching from the mouths of women. Belief based on sight, yet blessed beyond sight. Do I need to remind you that the word parable is parabola, which means the true story is a paradox. Every parable, Jesus said, the true story is a paradox. Aboriginal people understand this Western delusion. Jonathan will know the wonderful privilege of teaching Aboriginal adults. Of course there are two creation stories, one for saltwater teaching and one for freshwater. They contradict each other, and both are equally true. My Duai Maharaja wears a shirt that says 100% Yolnu, 100% Christian. So I hope tonight you'll begin to see the danger of this delusion of either or. And so the culmination of Greek thought, I'm going to leave that there because you can see that image is the center of it. The culmination of Hellenic thought is the great chain of being, with matter as the prison. The great chain of being is a description of the hierarchy of importance. Hellenic logic, the root source of all Western thought, is based on contradiction. The highest form of spirit is rationality, which is so utterly divorced from contradiction that the ultimate image of God is the unmoved mover. And they meant that literally. Therefore, a God who can never feel pain or compassion, because that would mean changing what is by essence unchangeable. With rationality, the only true mark of godliness, then it becomes possible to categorize the whole realm of cosmic existence. The stars, which never move, outrank the planets, which are precisely seeming stars that move. Landowning male citizens outrank working class males who do not have the leisure for education. Did you know that the word school comes from skole, the Greek word for freedom from work for pay? Slaves, of course, like all ho barbaroi, rank towards the bottom. Eagles which soar in the sky outrank moles who burrow in the earth. And everything outranks females. Females are the literal embodiment of fleshness. Their bodies produce, like unthinking plant life. Their wombs suck blood from the brain, so rational discourse is beyond them. And month after month, blood flows out from them to make plain to all that they are flawed and fallen, constantly in change. If you think I'm exaggerating, you need to know that one of the most common inscriptions on Greek walls was the words gnosis auton. It means know thyself. And you've probably heard that as an admirable term. But when it was scrawled on a wall, it was written on the outline of a tomb. Know yourself as a tomb of flesh. Flesh is the death prison from which only rationality can break free. Just like womb is the flesh prison from which males have to escape. So here's the point to this long beginning. A culture that defines itself as over against the literal contradiction of the world of created material reality will never value creation the way Jews, like Jesus, did. And a world that sees divine destiny as not only escaping, but for its own sake, reshaping, overcoming, and ultimately controlling the entire planetary environment will always end in crisis. Because we are part of that creation. It's our identity, and its well-being is fundamental to our own. The Greek captivity of Christianity is the world of patriarchy, and we are its inheritors. God help us. That was the starting point for my whole research. It gets worse. Of course. There it goes. No, it showed some green. I don't have that many slides. Can you move them if I ask? Perfect. We're not only captive to Greek thought, we capitulated to the Enlightenment. Have any of you seen this image before? Who recognizes it? Yeah?
Ghibli.
Ah, yes, it's from Studio Ghibli.
It's likely to castle in the sky.
Thank you, thank you. Which means that it's actually a picture of something much older. This is, and Ghibli Studio did it beautifully,
Yes.
the floating island of Laputa in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Not the most well-known of his journeys, but one of the most scathing in all Swift's brutal satire. Laputa is the land of pure reason, a heaven of rationality, where the privileged, leisured males can spend all their days thinking. Go and read that chapter after tonight, and you'll see why it's such a perfect mockery of Enlightenment thought. The clue, and it was Swift who gave it this, is the name itself. As all of you who know Spanish will have already worked out. La puta means the prostitute. Because centuries before Freud showed how our rational minds are constantly duped by our unconscious flesh, Swift knew it too. Reason is a whore. Let me quickly point out that crass phrase means that reason is bought and sold by fleshly desire. Rationality is itself an artifact of flesh. And any world it creates will be a dead place of feeling-less, disconnected solipsism, an empire of delusional patriarchal control.
Say it again.
I'd be love to. Reason creates a dead place of disconnected solipsism, no feeling for other, an empire of delusional patriarchal control. Now, Swift didn't quite live long enough to see it, but he would not have been surprised that the ultimate expression of the French experiment with a fully rational, controlling world of true enlightenment would go down in history as the Reign of Terror. We are its inheritors. God help us. We are presiding over a world, a reign of terror for the whole planet and every planetary citizen, every creature that is vulnerable. By capitulating to enlightenment, even the church has become a collaborator in the service of reason the whore. This world is a dead world, but there's another world. I hope the song is sounding in your ears as you see the screen.
Oh, no.
That is a repudiation of the Enlightenment. The dot point is called the missing middle, which is a phrase I learned from Reverend Dr. Amos Liana, a wonderful colleague at New Millennia from PNG. He was awarded his doctorate for examining the missiological implications of what's been described as the missing middle. He's talking about the fact that people live in a material world, and indigenous people were brilliant scientists of the material world. Their science still survives. They also shared with the Christian missionaries an understanding of the transcendent world of the ultimate creator God. And the ancestor beings were at the service of the creator God. But what was missing when the missionaries came to the New World was the middle realm. They were part of a church that had capitulated to the Enlightenment idea that everything we feel is true, and the stories passed down to us, and the imagery that pictures it is false superstition, part of a darkness of ignorance that the West needed to purge with enlightenment. The church resisted that for a long time, but in the end, it capitulated. It betrayed its own cultural roots. Because even the Greeks, believe it or not, the Greeks knew that the world was alive. Trees, water sources, winds, sacred sites, alive with spiritual presence. And that presence was holy and therefore dangerous. Nothing in the natural world was just a tool for human exploitation. If anything, the folk traditions of every culture on earth taught that we were the tools for exploitation by that whole middle realm of angels, demons, and ancestors.
everyone in this room has ancestors who believed that the world was alive, that wisdom mothers had access to knowledge that others could not know, old wives' tales, that failure to honor the spirit of a place, a tradition, a local legend, or special presences could seriously endanger you. First peoples everywhere shared that belief with our own ancestors, but by missionary times, all that heritage of interconnection, sacredness, ceremony, and law had been debunked by the Enlightenment. It was all either a superstitious illusion or, even worse, a devilish trick. Friends, it is one of the most tragic ironies of history that well-meaning missionaries met welcoming indigenous nations in post-Enlightenment times. So instead of sharing their common recognition of the creation as alive and blessed and dangerous and connected, they taught that living for Jesus meant all the rest of the cosmos had to be dead. There was a world for our ancestors, like for indigenous peoples everywhere, of angels and demons and ancestors. And it was the world of the Jews. We say this almost every communion. Almost every communion. Do you realize what those words are saying? The whole earth is full of the glory of God. It is not an empty, lifeless place for human beings in the name of God to exploit or discard. It shines out. Gerard Manley Hopkins, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will shine out like shining from shook foil. And we say it every time we have communion. And that word communion is precisely that point. The communion is the celebration of the flesh where God is present. But living for Jesus post-Enlightenment means all the rest of the cosmos has to be dead. Disembodied rationality is the triumph of patriarchy. I'm leaving that there because you'll see I'm going to a new place. Folk belief everywhere recognizes, like Freud did, that the world is neither dead nor at our disposal, and if we ignore it or we try to control it, it will rebel. And the price of that stubborn resistance will fall most painfully on the vulnerable. But then, that's what patriarchy is all about anyway. A continuous contest for power, especially the power to control. There's a wonderful phrase in a novel in America where an indigenous chieftain says, "For us, everything in the world is alive, but for the white man, everything is dead. And if it isn't dead, they kill it." That's the world we have chosen. And by choosing patriarchy, the world is in crisis. Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping are inevitable products of patriarchy. And all of us, like the planet around us, are its victims. Why in the world, then, do we still allow that heresy of patriarchal rational control to go unchallenged by churches and synagogues and mosques, where we celebrate the law given to Moses and the love incarnate in Christ? Why? Well, partly because we think we're post-Enlightenment people. And one of the lovely ideas of post-Enlightenment is that meta-narrative is something that's another form of superstition. It's not post-Enlightenment at all. It's the apotheosis of Enlightenment thought. Even the grand stories that tell the whole tale of human existence are just superstition. Leave it behind. We Christians have a story that counters that destructive reign of terror dominating our planet. It's a story as old as the planet itself, and at its heart is the one who redeems the whole cosmos, not through rationality or control, but through the kenotic, emptying reconciliation of compassion, compassio, to suffer alongside and within the flesh. But we lost our soul to the Enlightenment. I mean that literally. Souls was another superstition that reason abolished. Now the world is supposed to be postmodern, which is as deceptive and silly a phrase as post-colonial. And yet again, thinking Christians are capitulating. Postmodernism now claims that any grand narrative, any ancient foundation story which connects all things is yet another superstition. We can say we have a truth, but everyone else can have their own because meta-narrative is forbidden. Friends, we're living in the midst of a meta-narrative. Patriarchy is that meta-narrative. And unless people of faith are brave enough to counter with the even bigger story of Mother Earth and all cosmic creatures interfused with the spirit of divine compassion, our own theology will be one more victim in the crisis we face. So let me show you an illustration of the meta-narrative that could save the world. The dominant view of theology is theism. This is what it looks like. There's God, and there's the world. God is above the world with an arrow that's one-way traffic. God affects everything in the world, but nothing in the world affects God. That's the Greek unmoved mover. And when we talk about transcendent God, that's what we have in our minds. The cosmos is the place of God's absence, but God's control. And the whole point behind my PhD was the argument that Western people, even when they call themselves atheists, have that image of God directing their actions in life. Theism is why patriarchy can work. But there's another answer. One answer is pantheism. Biocentric traditions sometimes respond to theism with pantheism. In pantheism, God and the cosmos are one and the same. There is no God apart from the cosmos, and no part of the cosmos that is not in God. This is a better alternative than theism, because at least it reconceives nature as God-infused and sacred, so that humans who defy nature are defiling God. But there are three problems with pantheism. And let me say that pantheism is the building up of what's sometimes called monistic thought. Monism means there is God and there is the world and they are the same. And my problem is that is that pantheism can't respond to three things that matter to me. The first is the problem of evil. If everything is divine, why did evil emerge and why does it persist? My own PhD dealt with this in too much detail to cover here, but in essence, the crisis of climate change requires a radical shift in ethics and praxis. But if there's no divinity apart from the existing cosmos, if all we have is what we already are, where can that shift come from? Where is the new energy to move to a new world of relating? The second problem for me is because I take the basis of union seriously, which means that I have to be guided by the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. And to those suffering, I've edited my thing by mistake here. The scriptures talk about a God who is not just contiguous with the world. God spoke and it was so. The problem is we have in pantheism a God that is no bigger than what already exists. Now, at least if we have a cosmic view of God, that's a lot bigger than the evolutionary haters that I grew up in fundamentalism with, who had a God who only lived 6,000 years. At least we have a 12 billion year old one if we follow science. But if they're just the same, there's something wrong with that. And it's that something wrong that the scriptures help reveal us. And it comes into the end with the idea that I have often used in counseling. To those suffering in this life, God says, I will be what you need me to be. There's the first beautiful phrase to utter to those who hurt. God says to them and does not lie, I will be what you need me to be. But when you are ready, and sometimes before you are ready, I will be more. That's the God that I believe in. And that God has a different name, what happened there? There we go. Look at this word, panentheism. I discovered this one when I was studying. There's God. There's the cosmos. Right? Panentheism means that everything exists is interfused with God. But there is more to God than the existing cosmos. That more that God can be is the key to a worldview that could save the earth. I want to make my bold claim plain. I believe the transcendence of God is the source of novelty, complexity, and diversity in the cosmos. Not only does God's immanence, that means every part of God is within and alongside the cosmos, provide its progress from emptiness into radically complex fullness. Let me just remind you, because astrophysics was something I studied just before I did my PhD. Astrophysics is based on an utter paradox. Out of almost nothing, they get as close to defining it as nothing as they possibly can. So it's virtually ex nihilo, even though the astrophysicists don't know they're doing that. Out of that, what we call the Big Bang happened. And what happened as a result of that is that Newton's law of thermodynamics, that the world will always left alone decline, lose its complexity, lose its energy, and dissolve into oneness, into sameness. But those same scientists believe that's not what happened, and that every day, even as we speak, new complexity, new diversity, new complex order is emerging. Some scientists are so desperate to try to explain that they have 11 parallel dimensions of universe, because something has to explain how that novelty gets into this one. The old rule, the simplest solution is the best. To me, that's God. God is what brings the complexity from God into embodiment in the world. And that means the mission of God's love will eventually bring an end forever to the fallenness of cosmic entropy. I want you to hear that phrase again, because I want you to know on what side we are in this crisis. The mission of God's love will bring an end forever to the fallenness of cosmic entropy. Newton's law will dissolve into the fecundity of God's presence. And I hope at least some of you will recognize that as Paul's vision in Romans 8. And if you remember that quote, you'll also remember Paul's extraordinary claim that human beings, especially those reconciled by the cosmic Christ, will be part of the agency that brings that promised end described in the basis of union. That's the end in view for the whole cosmos. A reconciliation that means that entropy itself is the final enemy to be destroyed. That is the mission of God, bringing this into the world. And here is the really scary part of my PhD thesis, the claim. Now it's complex language, but I hope you can get how crazy this is. The utterly unpredictable emergence of consciousness into the cosmos, because that's another emergent thing that shouldn't be there. Where did it come from? The universe is conscious because of us. We are the consciousness of the universe. There may be others, but we don't know. As far as we know, we are the cosmos becoming conscious of itself. And that means that we are crucial partners with God by enhancing novelty, complexity, and diversity in the cosmos. There's the progressive that I'm talking about. This is my progressive manifesto. It's more radical than professive. I'm nailing it to the door of the church. Christianity betrays Christ whenever it fails to defend or even defies novelty and diversity. That means the vexing diversity of identity politics, as well as the rights of existing species not to be exterminated. Did you read that statement that was circulated? It's extraordinary. The rights of nature and of future generations. the future will not be able to experience its right to expressive diversity and fullness if we impoverish the resources of Earth in this generation. Panentheism means that such impoverishment is not just stupid greed or stubborn sinfulness. It is acting against God's own design in creation. And because God is genuinely present within and experiencing fully with the cosmos, hurting creation is wounding God. In my thesis, I actually said, biocide is deicide. It is killing God's presence in the cosmos. So the way we envisage God doesn't just influence, it determines how we act towards creation. So we need to take theology seriously, because unless we enshrine an alternative to the sovereign absolute, we simply cannot resolve this planetary crisis. I'm going to stop in a moment for questions, but I want to give you one word that I used in my PhD, that one of my examiners said, if you ever publish it, get rid of that word. Because I coined it myself. I talked about that image as God interwombing
I was
the
looking at that
universe.
picture thinking of woman's egg. Sorry.
You were right. And the reason I used it is because the word that theologians often use is God interpenetrating. And you know what the root word of penetrate is, don't you?
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that it's not just hyperbole to talk about how, for example, fossil fuel companies are raping Mother Earth. Indigenous people feel that absolutely literally, and because it is their mother, they feel it in their own flesh. And so does God. But God is interwombing all things. And this gives rise to one of my most interesting ideas. Power is impotent. It controls, but it never produces. It puts limits on, or it impoverishes, but it never is fertile. Power is impotent. It is the powerless who have potency. Potency always comes from those without power. And if you feel helpless as I do in the crisis we face, we need to hold on to that interwombing presence of God that in our powerless makes new birth happen. It's been a long journey. I promise that the next part is much shorter, but I'll take a time for questions briefly. I don't want to hold up too long.
And friends, questions have to be made to this microphone because of the live streaming. So, Jess is the first cab off the rank with the question.
Yeah, really.
My question is focused around your statement that God will be what you need God to be. Where does it say that in the Bible?
It doesn't use those words in the Bible. That's my paraphrase of my understanding of God's presence. It doesn't say that. But it does say, even though I go into the depths of hell, there you are. In the darkness, you are light. In the shadow of death, God is with me. So that's about God being in our presence at the utmost points of need, which I do think is a biblical view.
Can you tell me what Bible verse so I can look up later? Can you tell me what Bible verse?
The two most powerful passages about that are both from the Psalms. Psalm 23, which everyone knows, even though I walk in the valley of death's shadow, I will not be afraid because you are with me. And then Psalm 139 is the imminence psalm. Wherever I go, God is already there. Even when I was in the womb being knitted together, God was there. So those are two really key passages. And it's very powerful because it means there is no place we can hide from the love of God.
Thank you. Now, over here is the next question, and then I'll go to the back.
Half question, half comment. I was just going to say, isn't there a translation of I am what I am that you can read as I will be what I will be? Which reminds me of say.
Thank you for that question. It's absolutely a wonderful one. There's a very long answer I could give to this, which is in an unpublished book I'm still working on, which is a book against patriarchy. But the short answer is the word that is in Hebrew, esher, literally means I am what I am doing. And what I believe God means by that is I'm not going to give you a secret word of power that gives you the power over my name. I won't have a name that you can use like a wizard that you want to summon. But if you want to know who I am, watch what I am doing. And I'll take 1 minute more. This came from a wonderful seminar where a Jewish woman, in a meeting of the Council of Christians and Jews, the first time the International Committee met in the Southern Hemisphere, and I was giving a presentation on the Sabbath and creation. This woman, Jewish woman, talked about Hagar as the messenger of God, because Hagar goes out from being sent away by Sarah, and there God meets her. And she is the only woman in the Bible who not only hears God speak to her, but speaks back to God. It's extraordinary. And she gives God a name. You are the God who has heard me. Because God listened to her suffering. And if you look at the context of that text to Moses, what does God say? I have heard the sufferings of my people, the cries of my people. I have seen their suffering. I am the God. Who am I? I am the God who sees and who hears and who sends rescue. So that's what God is doing. And sometimes through Moses, and sometimes through us.
A couple of more questions to come up. Firstly, here.
I like reading about the cosmos. There's a good book about the cosmos for idiots. And I recognise that we live in a violent universe of such magnitude that it's almost impossible to comprehend. Why is it, Lee, that you think living on this little dot of dirt can understand what's happening in the whole of creation?
First, I wouldn't. It's a characteristic of patriarchy to be arrogant, and I don't feel arrogant enough to say we understand what's happening in the whole cosmos. But what I do believe, whatever else is out there, however many worlds there may be, we haven't found them yet. We haven't found any other intelligent life, even though the chances are good it might exist. But what we are is a people who can think about the nature of the cosmos. And there aren't any other species that do it to the extent of complexity that we do. That's what I mean by consciousness. In fact, I actually, at one point, thought of calling that chapter of my thesis the Consciousness Project, about how the universe wasn't fully developed until it thought about itself thinking. And that's what humans bring, I believe, to our dance of mutuality with God. I could talk a lot more about that, but the other point that I would make is it's true that the forces in the cosmos are extraordinarily violent, and we witness them all the time. There are two things that are really interesting about that. The first is, I had a wonderful Old Testament scholar friend who said to me, his favorite phrase was, God makes good. It's a great phrase. God doesn't stop evil from happening, but out of every evil is the potential for God to make good. And out of all of that violence, newness emerges. That's the first point. The second thing is, if you've studied the Cosmos for Dummies, and I was one of the dummies when I was studying it, believe me, one of the things that we now believe, it's still very hard to prove it with evidence. It's almost like the physicists are feeling their way to truth instead of rationally thinking it. They feel that the largest existence is what's called dark matter. We can't see it, we can't feel it, we can't interact with it, but it makes up 90% of the mass of the universe. It's called dark matter precisely because we can't find any enlightenment about it. But what it does say is that even the violence of a black hole is minuscule compared to this silent darkness out of which newness emerges.
Friends, I think we just have one more question before we go to the remaining section. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Lee. I'm very impressed with your articulation, and I'm also very sympathetic. But I have a question. We started with the Gospel of John, the Word became flesh. In your explorations of the Gospel of John, do you see a number of editors and authors? The last chapter of John could have been an insert, because there seems to be contradictory statements, and there's a lot of thought, as you know, that much of the Gospel of John could have been inspired by a sort of Gnostic Christianity. And I'm saying that because the Gnostic Christianity were otherworldly, and many groups of them hated the flesh. And it's almost reaching back to the Platonic scheme. Somehow or other, in my struggles, I'm trying to unite the Platonic and the flesh, because I think each has a valid message. But the Gospel of John, the authorship and Gnosticism, any comment, please?
Yes, it's a question that deserves a very complex answer, and I've also studied the Gnostics really with fascination because, among other things, many more women were leaders in the Gnostic communities. And I think it's actually one of the Gnostic characteristics of John that the first people who recognized Jesus are all women, all of them. And I don't think that's a coincidence. But what I also think is that John's gospel is true to that opening chapter all over the place. It's only in John's gospel that we get the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. We don't get a weeping Jesus anywhere else except in Luke, where he weeps over the fate of Jerusalem. And wouldn't he be weeping now? So, and in John's gospel, he says to Thomas, "Put your hand in my side." So John won't go with the Gnostics to the point of saying we give away the flesh. The place where the contradiction is strongest, I believe, is in his understanding and his use of the word world. You know, I don't ask that you take them out of the world, but that you save them from the world, and the world become. I think that wherever John is using that kind of language, it's a shorthand for what John earlier says, the world where darkness is chosen ahead of light. Because all the way through, Christ is the one who enlightens every creature, not just every human, every creature that comes into the world has the light of Christ. That is revolutionary. And John somehow holds it together. I've come quite late to this appreciation for John, but it's full of paradox, and I love that.
Thank you, Lee, for the way you've been able to respond to those questions. We actually had a question that's more like a comment from an online viewer. You've seen the question, and I think in many ways you've answered his implicit question that was in his comment, unless you wanted to say something about it, Lee.
I'll just quickly say, this was a comment about the idea of monism. No, I don't need to go back. You remember the slide for panentheism? That's another description of what's called monism, that all is one and one is in God. I chose a different word in my thesis. My thesis is what's called unitive thought. And alongside that Greek image was a wonderful poem by a man named Theodor Röpke, one of my favorite poems. And it starts out like this: I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. And it goes on and it says, one line is the key: we think by feeling. What is there to know? I hear my being dance from ear to ear. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. That's not monism. That's not where everything is reduced to one kind of formless unity. It's actually unitive. It says what makes creative union is precisely the richness of diversity. The richness of diversity. Only this past year on my birthday, I went to the Tiwi Islands and had a culture tour there. I have connections with the Yolngu in East Arnhem Land. I've got adopted kinship connections there. And the Yolngu, as some of you may know, like many other native First Nations people, have what they call two moieties. They're Yirija and Dua in the Yolngu culture. And they're used primarily as a guide to who's allowed to marry whom. But everything in the cosmos is one of those two dualities. So there's a creation story for the Yirija people and a completely different creation story for the Dua people. And they're both right. They're both true. I discovered in the Tiwi Islands, they have 4. So now I know if I study, there's probably 4 creation stories for them. So there's 4 complex intergroups. But the key is that every single one of those things is part of this deeper, unitive embracing of diversity. It's the oneness that is hugely and beautifully divergent. I'm going to push on because of timing. So this was my point, by the way. If we follow theism, then we have the natural world and we have human beings. Not embedded in nature. We can do whatever we want to nature because we're above it. We're separated from it. Nature is dead. It can't harm us. We can harm it. And that's where we are now with many, many of the forces around us. But if you have a panentheistic view, then this is how the relationship looks. And I quite love this set of slides, because the natural world and the human world intersect, but it's almost as though the project of God is to give human consciousness a little bit of transcendence, so that we could say to nature what God says to us: I will be what you need me to be. Don't we need that now? To say to the natural world, we will be what you need us to be, and we can even be more together. That's where I want to go with this. And here's the lovely thing. We have 2 clues for the way to go ahead. I've changed my slides here, as you can see. I just love this image. I've actually been to Uluru once, where there was a rainbow. It's an extraordinary sight, and I'm glad somebody made a picture of it. The Uniting Church alternative is to be progressive but with roots. So, we are always on the way to the promised end. That's what the basis of union tells us. It's our absolute DNA. And in fact, what it really implies is that we are the vanguard of Christianity. We're moving, if we have to, ahead of the rest of Christianity, not to leave the rest behind, but because somebody has to be following that path. But we come from our roots. And one of the things in our roots is a tradition that combines the notion of progress with the notion of protest. We are Protestants. Protestants. And by God, we need to be protesters. We define ourselves as the Protestant church on the way. And this is a world where our protests need to be resounding, because that's our ancestor tradition. That's our ancestors that we have to follow. And that means we have to be true to scriptures. If you read the Basis of Union and you're a member of the Uniting Church, you have a responsibility to study the scriptures, because you're a minister. Every member of the church is engaged to be a minister of Christ crucified. And we know how to do it by studying the scriptures. But the Basis of Union also has a phrase that's not present in any creed I know of in any other church in the world: guided by the legacy of scientific inquiry. We hold the scripture truth and the science truth together. And believe me, the cosmology, to the extent I understand it, lifts scripture into a whole new realm of being. Let me give you one of my favorite examples when I was teaching the Old Testament to my students. It's another psalm. Go back and read this sometime. Psalm 19. For me, that psalm is in the shape of a great bird, maybe the eagle dove of the Holy Spirit. And one wing reaches up to heaven. I stopped teaching this psalm by asking my students, who is the first preacher of God? Because the psalm tells you, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies reveal God's handiwork. There is no speech nor words, but their sound has gone out, and their words until the end of the world. And then another beautiful picture. Look at the sun. It comes out of its tent like a bridegroom on his wedding day and races across the horizon. Isn't that a wonderful image? The sun is the groom that can only be in fullness in relationship. And there it is, the heavens telling God's glory. And then the second one is all about the law of God, the teaching of the ancestors. And what the psalm is saying is there is only one law of life. And the same law that the heavens declare is in the law that was revealed through Moses and then embodied in Jesus Christ. And the wings of that dove connected so beautifully. And that's why the psalm says, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O God, my rock, the stability, and my Redeemer, making new. That's the uniting church. We need the rock and we need the redeeming, always on the way. And science can help us see that way. And guess what? They're not listening to scientists in exactly the same way they aren't listening to preachers. You know? We're comrades in being ignored. Can't we at least try harder to speak together? We are always on the way, but we have roots. And the word for roots is radix. It gives us the word radical. What makes us radical is our roots in protest. That's who we are. And like I said, God help us. God does help us. And God made a new thing in this land by making the uniting church, which I've heard many people say with some pride is the only indigenous Christian church in the world, in Australia. But what are the deeper roots? The deeper roots are expressed in the preamble to the Constitution. That's why I included that in your pre-reading. That document is more revolutionary than almost anything I can think of in our time. Okay? Most of you, I hope, will know that symbol. I forgot to bring my stole, but when I first became principal of New Millennia, they had my induction service, and an indigenous elder put on round my neck the stole of the UAICC, and I burst into tears. It was the climax of my life that I could be part of the covenant relationship with the first peoples of this world, of this nation. And so what that means is the preamble claims that God was in this land from the beginning. From the beginning. Guess what? Indigenous people didn't need to be told that. They knew it all along. The same God whose love was finally and fully revealed in Jesus Christ was speaking to First Nations people through law and language and law. Now what that means is we live on indigenous land. So who's going to interpret the voice of the land for us? We don't speak its language, but we need to learn it. I'm embarrassed by the fact I never took up the challenge when I was first giving my acknowledgement of Ghana people. A Kiwi man said, "Why aren't you speaking that in Ghana?" Good question. At least the Kiwis only have one language to learn. Aboriginal languages are extraordinarily complex. I tried to learn Barada from Meningrida, and I've studied Russian and Japanese and other languages. Barada was too tough. I couldn't wrap my head around it. But that is the language that knows the law of that land. The songs of the land are in the language of its people. And that language, like that law, was given by God, and it never stops. Because one of my favorite verses in the Bible is the picture of the great choir of heaven. Every tribe and language on earth. Oh, God's language is lost. No, it's not. It's sung in heaven. And if it's sung in heaven, you know what that means? That means ancestors are in heaven from the time before the Christian missionaries came. Because God knows that ancestor teaching is forever, and the new heavens and new earth will return to that legacy. If we truly want to respond to this crisis by caring for the earth, we need First Nations people to teach us how. How do they see the land? Here's just one example. I discovered that in Arnhem Land, the relationship that matters most is Mari Gutara. That usually gets translated as grandmother, grandchild. And that's a reasonably accurate way to treat it. But Mari Gutura is also our relationship with the land of the ancestors. It gives us our identity, and in return we care for it. The same way that a grandmother teaches us the truths of our experience, and we give them the care that an elder deserves. The land is our teaching elder. Our teaching elder. How can we treat it with contempt? How can we allow it to be defiled by outsiders? Would we allow that with our grandmothers? That's just one example of how radical our church can be when we recognize that we are grounded literally with the presence of God, enmeshed in the First Nations peoples. And what did I say about God's creation? In diversity is God's delight. So we don't have one Maori nation. We have nation after nation after nation after nation. Languages that are too complicated to learn. Groups that we don't understand. In traditional culture, every piece of land had 5 methods of overseeing through family connection. And all 5 connections, the people that controlled the surface of the land, the people that controlled what was underneath the land, the people that controlled the animals that go on that land, and the people that controlled the water sources that come up from under that land, and nothing could be done on that land until all 5 said yes. And sometimes you might hear, oh, we can't get an agreement because they're always arguing with each other. It's stupid white ignorance, because each of those people have a stake in that land, and the system of checks and balances in Aboriginal governance could heal democracy in our generation if if we are willing to learn from them. Now, at least in the Uniting Church, by making that preamble, we have made a promise to try. We are inheritors. And many of you are the grandmothers and grandfathers who have to be passing on that radical understanding of the Uniting Church in Australia, so that we truly can do what Jonathan talked about, to walk hand in hand toward a destiny together, for the sake of the God who never stops loving.
Bloody marvellous.
It does say questions here, but I think that applause means that people kind of felt like this is the right time to say yes to everything you've said. I may not agree with everything you said, but yes to what you said. And I think, Lee, we are so grateful that you have no idea what that journey from Darwin to Adelaide has been like, particularly when they cancelled the flight from, I mentioned this before, didn't I, from Sydney to Adelaide. Anyway, he's here. So, Lee, thank you very much for your very thoughtful and challenging presentation. I think now more than ever is the theme for Reconciliation Week this year, and somehow that there's a resonance in those words, now more than ever.
Yeah.
Just a couple of announcements before supper. First of all, the next forum will be on the 4th of July. No special significance for us with that date, when Mark Waters is going to talk about critical issues facing the future of Australia. Mark is a former CEO of Reconciliation SA, and I do know that he's going to begin his topic with these words: "I'm not racist, but..." So let's see where that leads, and I would certainly commend our next session to you all. The Wilkes Oration, of course, is coming up on the 20th of June, a big event. The problem is it's booked out. But you can book online to live stream. That's a signal event here for the Effective Living Centre on the 20th of June. Please make sure to leave your feedback form before you go, even if you just rate what you think about the place, but although there's plenty of room for any comments you might make. Leave them. They're on the front desk, and leave the ones that you filled out to put on the front desk. Now, Esmond Dowdy is going to make a little announcement here. Over to you, Esmond. Thank you.
Thank you. The Progressive Christianity Task Group, which oversees progressive Christianity, has been looking at how it might operate in the future. We usually meet once a month, but what we've discovered recently, excuse me, I should have been talking more tonight. What we've discovered is at each meeting, we're so efficient that we haven't got a lot of business to do. So we did think about, will we meet every other month? But at the last meeting we decided, no, we'll meet every month, and we'll include a conversation in the first part of the meeting about something relevant to progressive Christianity. So the meeting will be an hour. That's a discussion, a reflection on some relevant topic. And everyone is invited to that. So what we thought, we'd make it an open invitation to anyone who'd like to come to this conversation, and what the next one will be on the 18th of June is looking at the prologue of Hugh Mackay's book, The Kindness Revolution. I would imagine there isn't anybody that wouldn't want to see a kindness revolution, is there? And the byline for the book is how we can restore hope, rebuild trust, and inspire optimism. So if you would like to attend that on the 18th of June, here at the Effective Living Centre at 1:30. And I've prepared a little handout that if you're interested in that activity, that initiative of PCNet, then feel free to take one of these from the table, have a look at it and see whether that's a conversation you'd like to enter into for an hour at the beginning of the meeting on the 18th of June. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmond. I do see the word benediction there, and I have a feeling that, Lee, you may have had a benediction for us tonight, is that right?
Mine.
And in which case, before we go to supper, and please stay for supper, I know it's late, but you know, it's warm and comfortable here. Lee, would you like to give us that benediction?
And Esmond set it up beautifully because the word kindness comes from the word kinship. And some of you who know Hebrew will know that one of the greatest words of all in the Hebrew Bible is the word hesed. It's usually translated something like abiding love. It's actually better translated as kinship love, the love of God for the cosmos that is kindred to God. Kindness, that wonderful phrase, God has shown you what is good and what does God require, but to do justice, to love kindness, to love in kinship love, and to walk humbly with God. And so may the God who walks humbly with us, ready to be what we need, and always ready to call us to more, be with you this day